Do you dig demography? I do. It's a bit of a hobby of mine because I don't play golf or go dog sledding. I know very well when I got interested in it. I happened to be in Vienna just after 9/11, and there was a maternity shop, a mother care type joint. And the people going in and out seemed to me not quite representative of the more general population around me in the streets. So I opened the door and took a ganders, and it changed the way I look at the world. Because if you go into a maternity shop or a kindergarten, that's a good clue as to the world you're going to be living in 20 years' time. By the way, speaking of demography, Mothercare in the UK is out of business, which may be all you need to know about UK demography. But as I said, I'm just an amateur. If they had a talent show with Simon Cowell for amateur demographers, Demographic Idol, the Demography Factor, Britain's Got Demographers, I'd give it a go. But until that day, I'm going to leave it to the professionals like Paul Morland, who has written one of the most important books you will read this year, Tomorrow's People, The Future of Humanity in 10 Numbers. And they're 10 very arresting numbers. Paul Morland joins me now. Paul, great to see you, and congratulations on this book. I take it it's because it's because as a professional demographer, you understand that people have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. So you chose these 10 numbers as a way to just so that even the biggest simpleton can get what's going on.
Well, they're a way into the story. I wrote a book a long time ago. Actually, it was based on my PhD thesis, and a friend read a draft and he said, too many numbers, not enough story. So I think you need to combine the numbers with the story. If you can make those numbers really arresting, if you can get those into people's minds and get them to think about them, then you can draw the story out from the numbers and you can make people understand, you can bring to people's attention how those numbers are representative of much bigger trends in the world.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to one of those little vignettes you present in the book, because it made me have a think about certain things in a different light. But the biggest number you have here is 4 billion, which is projected to be the population of Africa at the end of this century. And that's basically going to be half the planet. Half the planet will be African. And that's a huge change, because if you go back just 100 years, the population of the British Isles and the population of British West Africa were more or less exactly the same. England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales versus what's now Nigeria, the Gambia, Ghana, Sierra Leone and so forth. People don't quite grasp the difference in scale in what's happened in Africa.
I think there's another way of putting it which might resonate with people, which is if you go back to 1950, there were 2 Europeans for every sub-Saharan African. And by the end of this century, there are going to be 6 or 7 sub-Saharan Africans for every European. And I think that is going to change the world. Now, I can't tell you exactly how it will change it. I always say that demography is one lens on the future, but it's only one lens. But for sure, when there are 6 or 7 times as many Africans as Europeans, versus when, going back to 1950, there were twice the number of Europeans to Africans, it will change everything. It's going to change the demography is the sort of fundamental thing. It's going to change economics. It's going to change global strategy, military power. It's going to change culture. It's going to change food. It will be a very different world when the weightings of the 2 continents are so very different.
Yeah, it's going to change something. You can have a debate over what that change will be, but the idea that there will be nothing changed, I think is ridiculous. Now, you then have another number of yours, which is from California, regarding ethnic change, and that number is 22, which is the percentage of Californian school children who are white. So very quickly, the United States is going to become what they call a majority-minority country, as it were. And again, this has all happened really in the space of just 30 or 40, since the Rwandan genocide, more or less.
Yes, and I feel I'm sort of skating a little bit on ice when I talk about these things, and I try to be dispassionate and fairly neutral about them, because I think before you can have a debate, a meaningful, grown-up, sensible debate about these things, and if you don't debate them, I think you're leaving them to the fringes and to the nutters. But before you can have a sensible, grown-up debate on issues like immigration, on issues like ethnicity and ethnic change, I think it's very helpful to have some facts and some numbers to hand. Now, some people may think that's a wonderful thing. California has become more diverse, and others may regret it. I think it is a reasonable issue to discuss, but I only think it's reasonable for reasonable people to discuss it when they know the facts.
Right, which is very important. You also make what I thought was a very interesting point, is that people can over time become something other. Nigel Farage always likes to point out that his family came here as Huguenot refugees, and there doesn't seem anything terribly Huguenot about Nigel these days. He's become more English than most of the English that his family settled among. And you make the point, which really actually tickled me in a strange way, because you pointed out that at the height of the so-called Irish Troubles, when the IRA were targeting all the most powerful men in the country, the guys they were actually targeting, the two most powerful, were Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey. And those are both Irish names, but at some point they managed to become English, I think in the case of Healey, and Welsh in the case of Callaghan. So
well, Callaghan sat for a Welsh constituency, but he sat for a Welsh constituency, but he was actually English. Minor point.
Yeah, so the Irish became English in this case, and that you can see that the Irish became French Quebecois in eastern Quebec in Canada. You can see that. I wonder, though, do you think that's something that can be done at an unlimited level, or is it just occasionally, as with Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey?
Well, it did work the other way as well. I mean, you had Republican leaders in Northern Ireland with names like Hume and Adams. So it was a two-way street. It certainly can occur at a certain level. I mean, I would hold myself up as an example of that, if I may. As far as I know, I don't have a single ancestor born in the UK. Both my parents came from Germany. I now consider myself a quarter Ukrainian, since one of my grandfathers was born in what was then an obscure corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I feel completely British. So, of course, it can happen. I think what happens, however, is that it is a matter of time, and it is a matter of critical mass. So I think when you get very, very large movements of people in a very, very short space of time, there is little incentive for them to integrate into the wider society, because they can create little worlds of their own. Over time, I think integration will happen if one limits immigration, or if immigration is fairly limited, but very, very large numbers of people moving very, very fast across continents. And I think the chance of that kind of integration is much lower.
I would agree with you on that. Just there's a big takeaway from the book that I heard just the other day being discussed on an American radio show. Someone must have got an advance copy of it, and they're calling it Morland's Trilemma. And this is where you're inviting people to. I think you use the examples of the UK, Israel, and Japan, where you can say there's a choice. There's three choices. You can pick any two, but you're not going to get the hat trick. Just explain that for us.
So I'll explain it in the context of those countries, if I may. Japan has decided it doesn't want mass immigration. It wants to retain its ethnic homogeneity. And it has got more immigration than it had, but very, very limited. And it has decided it doesn't want to have large families. So they're giving up, they're being what I call egotistical, perhaps, in not having large families and meeting their own personal requirements first. And they wish to retain the these E of egotism and the E of ethnicity. And what's taken a hit has been the Japanese economy. Britain, meanwhile, we've also had the egotism of fairly small family sizes, but we have effectively kept our economy going. And the trade-in has been that we have had mass immigration and very rapid ethnic change. The Israelis, by contrast, have chosen to have large families. It's extraordinary. They have 3 children per woman in an advanced society, more than a child, more than any other country at that kind of level of development. And their economy has boomed. But what they've given away is the nappy changing at 4 o'clock in the morning in order to keep a predominantly Jewish state and a booming economy, and not get mass immigration of people who don't meet their ethnic criteria, and at the same time to keep the economy going.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's no way you can get to all 3. And so you've got the Japanese, whether that nation survives, whether that people survive, they're quite content to die as Japanese, and they've made that, and they've all but made that choice explicitly. And then you have others, which is like most in Western Europe, North America, who say, well, okay, we've given up having babies, but we can import people to have the babies we couldn't be bothered having ourselves. Now, when you look at that, Paul, is there any guys like Viktor Orban have tried to reverse it? I drove into Hungary from Ukraine the other day, and it's got a big sign there saying, "Welcome to Hungary, family friendly," and that's great. But actually, is it possible to reverse demographic decline?
Well, in the famous words of Deng Xiaoping, it may be too early to say. We haven't had 200 years of trying. What's clear is that governments can be very effective at helping get fertility rates down in countries that are developing. They're pushing at an open door. If they distribute contraception, a little bit of propaganda, a little bit of encouragement, and you can see staggering falls in fertility. Or they can go the coercive route, which I don't think is necessary, which is the Chinese route. Hungary and Russia actually stand out as examples of countries that have very, very low fertility and are throwing a lot of money at trying to revive the birth rate. And for technical reasons, it would seem that although the birth rate's gone up a little in both countries, it's probably not because of these policies, and these policies are only going to make a marginal difference. And what you can say for sure is even if these policies are making a positive difference, they're no way going to get you anything close to the 2+ that you need for the population in the long term to be stable. So what I argue very strongly is that what this is about ultimately is not about government support, although there's certainly things governments can do. It's about culture, it's about attitudes, it's about people's choices and how those choices collectively are national and amount to national and ethnic choices.
So when you see somewhere like Ireland, which north and south of the border has a fertility rate of about 1.7, which is sort of incredible for the way people thought about Irish, particularly Irish Catholics, just a couple of decades ago. They're not having enough children to replace themselves. In Scotland, it's even worse, which is 1.3. So you're actually declining quite dramatically. And your view is that you can nibble at it at the margins, but you're not really ever going to get it up to 2.1 or higher again.
One thing that really matters is when that fertility rate went down. So in the case of Ireland, it was still pretty healthy 20 years ago. And in Britain, we've had 50 years of sub-replacement fertility, and only in the 2020s are we going to have more deaths than births. So it takes a long time to work through. And Ireland, although it is sub-replacement in Ireland, it's recent enough that the population still has natural growth. And they've got a few decades of natural growth, and people don't worry about it until it's kind of too late. It would have been great if Britain had been worrying about it in the 1970s, but at that point there were still plenty of youngsters coming into the workforce from previous baby booms.
Yeah.
And by the time it hits, you then have a relatively small number of young people. So even if you get the fertility rate up, and each of them is having enough children in long term to replace themselves, in the short term, there just aren't enough young people having children compared to the oldsters dying. So I think there's a lag. The problem is there's a lag, and by the time governments get to it, it's often somewhat too late, and what governments do is ineffective. Yeah. I think it's a change of culture, approach, attitude, and what people aspire to. And ultimately, I'm not preaching. Ultimately, I'm trying simply to point out that if people have certain preferences and certain cultural attitudes, there are certain consequences.
No, well, that's why the Morland's trilemma thing is interesting, because it boils it down, says these are the choices. Japan made one, Israel made another, the United Kingdom's made the third. And it's very easy to understand like that. But because I don't want to sound like just a big gloom and doomer, there are advantages to an aging society. And it means, you know, your chances of doing well at the Grammy Awards or the Oscars or other, you know, young pop culture things are diminished. But a theme of your book that sort of percolates through it in various aspects is that an old society is not prone to war and revolution, because we're basically all sitting at home watching Coronation Street with our mug of cocoa or whatever. And I was thinking about it because the thought occurred to me first, I think about 20 years ago. Marine Le Pen is running in the French presidential election this weekend. And when her dad got into the final round in 2002, and he looked he's still around, but he looked pretty decrepit even then. And I was saying, my European friends keep telling me that the strong man on the horse is going to come along. Well, here's the big right-wing strongman, and he's too old to get up on the horse and go forth into battle. And it's a very, we talked last time about how it's so weird, these two aging societies, Russia and Ukraine, going to war when they've got no young men to throw into the fight. It just, and I wonder if that, you know, as I said, it probably underlines the risk calculation in Afghanistan. It's certainly got to underline the risk calculation for China, where they've got, you know, tens of millions of surplus young men there are no young ladies for. That changes the character of a society.
I think it does, and in the case of Russia, and certainly the case of China, even when they go into population decline, they are going to have huge numbers of young men. So creating an army to invade a neighbour is not a problem. They're going to have plenty of people to do it. The issue, I think, is that as the society ages and families get smaller, there's enormous pressure, social pressure, against sending that one son off to battle. And we see heartbreaking stories, both from Ukraine and from Russia, of a mother with one child in whom she's invested all her hopes. At 24, 25, he dies on the battlefield. So certainly in a democratic society, there's huge pressure against that sort of thing. And it's interesting that the casualty figures are being kept from the Russian people. And the mourning mothers are mourning privately, effectively. At some point, that may well tip, and you may get a change of sentiment in Russia when they start to realise that in a few weeks of war in Ukraine, they've lost more men than they did in Afghanistan, and they've got fewer and fewer men to lose.
Now, when you made that point that the Irish entered the demographic death spiral, as it were, a little later than the English did. The Scots thing I actually find particularly interesting, because I just can't understand the point of an independence movement when you've got insufficient young people to staff the new nation. That doesn't make any sense to me. But when you say it depends, there's a huge difference between whether you enter the death spiral in 1998 or in 1972. Isn't demographics a question of last man standing? So that, for example, when you talk to I think it's the young lady from Niger in the book, that actually she's got a huge advantage because they're going to be the last people to go in for sub-replacement fertility.
Well, there are two. There's something I called, I think in my last book, The Human Tide, last mover advantage. We hear of first mover advantage. I mean, certainly Britain had first mover advantage. It had a population explosion and it did colonise huge chunks of the world and shape huge chunks of the world as a result. But I think your point on Africa is true, that whenever the Africans choose to significantly lower their fertility rate, they will still have an enormous population growth ahead of them, and they will be the last man standing. So that's really significant. But I also think the other thing about Africa is that there's a general rule that the later you go through this demographic transition, the more dramatic it is. So what's happened in Africa is we've had a fantastic drop in mortality rates. It's not like people used to have 2 or 3 kids and now they're having 7 or 8. People used to die like flies. And a little bit of intervention, a bit of healthcare, a bit of education makes enormous difference. Infant mortality rates drop far, far quicker in Africa than they did in the UK. When you're at the cutting edge of that drop of mortality, it's pretty slow. In Africa, it fell like a cliff. So if fertility takes a while to come down, you get much stronger population growth than you did, say, in Britain in the 19th century, when mortality did drop by historic standards then very sharply, but it took a long time to come down. And therefore, fertility started to come down equally, and the excess of fertility over mortality, which is the population growth, wasn't such a big deal. In Africa, it's been that dramatic drop in mortality rates, that very late adoption of what we call the demographic transition. While fertility rates have held up quite a long time, that has been fueling this and will continue to fuel this enormous population growth in Africa, which is quite globally unprecedented.
You make the point that there's high levels of female illiteracy in certain parts of Africa, so they don't have a lot of choice about, getting out of the house and going off and starting a software company in the capital city. It's not open to them. But it's more interesting in some ways to look at it from the other way around, where something that we used to take for granted, such as the maternal instinct, can actually be wiped out in a significant part of the population. I think something like 42% of German university, female university graduates in Germany don't have any children. That would seem at odds with how we used to think of women and the maternal instinct.
Well, I wonder if there always was more of a spectrum in terms of the maternal instinct. But as you say, when you don't have an education, you don't have choices. When women do get choices, some continue to want to have large families and others will choose not to. And that results in a lower fertility rate. I think there's some fascinating work been done, and I don't know how reliable it is, that suggests maybe pronatalism, both in men and women, loving children and wanting to have children, is genetic. Now, in the past, that gene didn't matter because nobody could really control their fertility. But in a world where people can control their fertility, all the people who don't want to have kids will effectively die out. And we could have, perhaps the only hope for a revival in fertility rates in developed countries is that the people who are having children have that pronatal gene which gets passed down. I'm not a geneticist. I don't know if that's true, but it's a very interesting thought.
No, that's actually a fascinating point, because when I said something like that Scottish statistic, that it's 1.3 children per woman, that doesn't mean that every Scottish woman is having 1.3 children. It means that some women are having 4 and 5 kids and others are having none at all. So
I think we can
if
say
you're right about
no
the
Scottish
genetics,
women are having 1.3 children, actually.
No, that's safe. I won't even get into some of these. Just heard tootling along the road the other day on the radio that all redheads will be extinct by the next century. So there's all kinds of consequences to this, big and small. But it is a terrific book, and I think we're going to get you back to talk about it a bit more, because this is actually the biggest issue of our time. Thank you very much, Paul. The book is called Tomorrow's People. Thank you. The Future of Humanity in 10 Numbers.